Every claim tells a story, and some are stranger than fiction. Welcome to the F-Files. When claims get weird, we get to work.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the F-Files. I'm Mandy.
And I'm Daphne.
And today kicks off the first episode in a series where we're going to examine investigations through the lens of a state agency, a federal contractor, a commercial health plan, and a vendor like us.
To help us compare and contrast these worlds, we've invited three of our colleagues to share perspectives from their previous experiences conducting investigations. One from a UPIC, one from a commercial health plan, and one from a state Medicaid agency. But before we jump into those introductions, Mandy and I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like working in a vendor SIU.
Yeah, so to set the stage for our discussion, the Healthcare Fraud Shield SIU is basically an extension of our clients. So, as investigators at a vendor, we have to adapt to our clients' policies, their processes, their culture, and ultimately, our goals as investigators are going to be aligned with our clients. And I would also call us generalists. So instead of specializing in one line of business or one state's regulations, or even just like one specific aspect of the investigative process, we actually know how to conduct each step in the process. And we'll do everything from data mining, writing up proactive leads, working on statistical sampling, conducting medical record reviews, and even recovering overpayments. Um, but I think the most unique thing about working for a vendor is that we actually had to view our work as a product. So this means that every activity that we're undertaking has to demonstrate a return on investment for our client. Every single report we write has the dual function of being a marketing piece, where we're just demonstrating our value in addition to our findings. And this really does bring an intense focus on high level communication where we're giving our clients clarity so they can make important business decisions. Daphne, does that ring true to you, or do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think you covered all the bases, Mandy. This is my first job in the healthcare fraud industry, and so far I love that it's given me an overview of how most of the investigative pieces work. I don't know a whole lot about the insurance side, the Medicaid side, Medicare. I don't even know like what the insurance companies do other than what we provide them. So it'll be interesting to hear about that. I also love that this job has so much variety. And as much of an A type personality as I am, my day usually tends to look a little bit different than my strictly scheduled layout. Do you
Hmm.
run into that too?
Definitely.
It really keeps me on my toes and makes me think outside of the box. And with that, I would say that if the vendor realm was a famous movie quote, it would be from Forrest Gump. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Does that resonate with you too?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
A few of my other favorite lines from that movie are stupid is as stupid does, run, fraudster, run, and I'm not a smart man, but I know what fraud is. And that brings us to our guests today who have been there and done that in other SIU environments. We're super excited to introduce them. They're our colleagues. We love them all so very much, and we're happy to be working with them on a daily basis. Kate worked in a ZPIC. Savannah worked in a commercial health plan, and Janice worked for a state Medicaid entity. Welcome, ladies, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you guys. So I'm going to start with an introduction for our most senior investigator, Kate. And one sort of interesting fact about Kate is that she's my sister. So I love her. Now, she's 6 years younger than me, but anybody that knows us both knows that she's 10 times smarter. And Kate actually is part of the reason that I'm working here. So, Kate, you're the best. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, I don't know, how long you worked here, what your title is? that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's not even remotely true, Mandy. So, I mean, I am your sister. That part's true. But I'm not smarter than you. Everyone else would agree with that. But yeah, I do love that we used to share a room and now we share a workplace.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I am a manager here at Healthcare Fraud Shield, one of the SIU services managers, and I've been here 5 years in June. And yeah, thanks again for having me on.
Kate, I understand you worked for Z-Pick, which I understand is now called a U-Pick. I don't know what encouraged the name change from a Z to a U, but whatevs. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working there and how different it is from vendor SIU?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to throw out a disclaimer that it has been 10 years since I left my role there. So a lot could have changed, but when I started there, they were actually called a PSC. So there's a lot of alphabet soup going on here. And PSC stood for Program Safeguard Contractor. Those then turned into ZPICs, which is a zone program integrity contractor. And now they are UPICs, which happened after I left, Unified Program Integrity Contractor, I believe. Regardless, what that means is they're essentially regional entities that are contracted by CMS to do the program integrity activities for Medicare, as well as some of the dual Medicare, Medicaid beneficiaries. I believe Mandy spoke to us being generalists at Healthcare Fraud Shield, and one way that the ZPIC contrasts is we were definitely specialists. I began as a complaints investigator there, and I would basically triage beneficiary complaints just to see if they warranted further action or if they were billing errors or something of that nature. And then I later moved up to the Medicare Medicaid investigations team. Regardless, though, on either team, investigations were all I did. I did perform some level of data analysis as part of that role, sometimes high level administrative review of medical records, like to check for signatures, that sort of thing. But for the most part, I stuck strictly to investigative activities. So we had a data analysis team that did our reports and created our SVRSs, or statistically valid random samples, as Mandy referred to earlier. And we had a team of nurse coders who did all of our medical record reviews. Another contrast would be how we got our leads. Um, of course, proactive data mining is a component of our services here, but at the ZPIC, all of our leads came from either our data analysis team, who had a work plan that they would data mine according to that work plan. Sometimes the MAC, or the Medicare Administrative Contractor, would flag something as suspicious and send it over to us. I mentioned beneficiary complaints. That was a large source of those. And we also had some algorithms that would flag suspicious billing behavior, and we would pursue those leads. We would sometimes initiate our own cases, but that wasn't required. And when it happened, it was usually like a happy accident. Our investigative process, for the most part, was very similar to what we do here for many of our clients. So, that would consist of data analysis, running financials, doing background checks, verifying licensure, looking for exclusions. But beyond that, interviews were actually an integral component to each investigation. They were basically mandatory, and that would mean both the beneficiary interviews as well as provider interviews. And the provider interviews were often performed during on-sites, which is another contrast. We would do on-sites about once a month, sometimes even more. And during those, we would interview office staff in addition to the providers and scan records and documents to bring back to the office with us, tour the facility, take pictures, that sort of thing. Trying to think of other contrasts. The referral process is admittedly a little hazy for me. I have had a child, and there was a pandemic and a cross country move since my time there. So it definitely feels like a lifetime ago. But I do recall us on occasion referring to HHS OIG or FBI for like criminal law enforcement activities. And at the conclusion of all of our cases, we would have to refer them to the MAC or the Medicare Administrative Contractor, because they would be the ones to adjust the claims and send out the request for recoupment.
And one of my favorite stories, Kate, that you always tell is how you had to interface with the Russian mafia with your on-sites
Yeah.
and how you wore pearls to pass as a Russian. Um,
Yes. I didn't know that, that would make me pass, but one of it was an office manager I was interviewing, and he was Russian, and, they warned us before we went in, they're going to speak Russian in front of us, and they were very quiet when I was in the room. They only spoke English, and he kind of wagged his finger at me and said, "You're Russian, aren't you?" And I very coyly said no, and he said, "You're wearing pearls. Only Russian women would wear pearls during the daytime." So I just started wearing pearls to all of our on-sites, so that they would always speak English in front of me, essentially. And I'm not Russian, for full disclosure. So
That's awesome. That sounds like a lot of fun and actually just a little bit scary as well.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a great place to cut my teeth on, healthcare fraud investigations. But that said, I am really happy I'm where I am now, and safe and just not traveling all the time.
Well, speaking of being happy about being here, I want to introduce Savannah. So she's our newest team member and she's an absolute delight, everybody. Super, super fun. Tons of experience. So Savannah, tell us about yourself and, how working here might be different from what you used to do.
Yeah, hey Mandy, and hey everybody else. I'm Savannah. Definitely really excited to be here. For a little background, I'm a CPC and a CBCS through the AAPC and NHA. But before coming to Healthcare Fraud Shield and working here, I worked about 7 years in SIU investigations for one of the nation's largest commercial health plans. So everything I'm sharing today is going to come from a commercial standpoint instead of Medicare, Medicaid, anything like that. So, and just disclosure, it's all grounded in my personal experience. It can vary plan to plan, payer to payer, so on and so forth. So, working for a commercial plan was definitely interesting. The investigative work looked quite different than what people would imagine when they do hear SIU. Most of our focus wasn't on catching those large fraud rings or coordinated schemes. So instead, it was centered more on claim accuracy, making sure that claims are paying or not paying in a timely fashion, the members' experience, provider contracts. So if anyone's picturing something exciting like trench coats and dramatic takedowns, you may be a little let down on this front. It was usually a lot less like the TV drama you see and a lot more spreadsheets and medical record reviews. So, and that's because commercial investigations are a lot more contract driven than regulation driven. So the majority of the leads themselves, when I worked for this commercial payer, was directly from members. So we had our own fraud hotline and we'd get calls and complaints and referrals, and members would say things like, I was billed for this service I never received. I got a EOB for DME and I don't have any DME. This appointment never happened, or I had this appointment, but I didn't have an x-ray. So why am I getting billed for it? So and while the payer I did work for had internal and external monitoring tools, members were often our first line of detection. So the members may not have thought of themselves as auditors, but often they would notice something faster than a system could. So often when a case first came in, the first step is always reviewing the provider contract. In commercial insurance, the contract is Bible. It's everything. Contracts often will override other things like standard policies or general coding rules. So before looking closely at the claims themselves, we had to understand why the provider is doing what they were doing, if they were allowed to, and then from there, we would review billing patterns and the individual claim for consistency with the contract itself. So At that point, if needed, we would get medical records and we would confirm whether or not the documentation that we did get was supported as billed. But the goal itself wasn't necessarily to prove intent or label something as fraud, but to determine whether the claim was payable under the agreement. So as Kate was saying before, where there'd be referrals over to government agencies possibly, or there was those on-site visits, the commercial payers are usually more directed at, do we allow this claim or do we not? And then push it through the system and get going. Because when you're working with the SIU with a commercial payer, your job is to make sure that that commercial payer is doing right or wrong. So whether that's paying the claim or not paying the claim and protecting the members who have that insurance. So my role itself was mostly internal. So most cases were handled within the organization, stayed in the organization, and focused on like claim corrections, overpayments, or provider education. So if something ever did rise to the level of potential external reporting, it was often escalated to legal or compliance leadership, who then decided if a referral was needed and to whom. So investigators, unlike other departments in commercial, generally did not contact law enforcement or regulators directly. So I would say a few key things and lessons that came out of the work would be how important the contract is and how important speaking up is. So the provider contracts are often underused, and a lot of times investigators will learn the basics of what's allowed and what's not allowed, but a stronger understanding of the contract language can completely change the outcome of a case. You can find a little sentence in there that will say they can't do that, and your whole case is flipped upside down. Another importance was definitely speaking up. So at the 7 years I spent there, I felt like the largest thing I learned is commercial environments can often be resistant to change. Sometimes they'll be like, this is how we've always done it. This is how we do it. This is how we're going to train people to do it. But some of the best efficiency improvements can be made to the people who are working on the work itself, who are on the floor, who are doing the investigations, who are looking at the records. And it's those people who are willing to question the process and suggest better ones that make the biggest change. So I would definitely say utilize your contracts and speak up when you see something that could be done better. As far as pros and cons go, I would say the biggest advantage of working for investigations in the commercial industry is that it's pretty simple. It's more the simplicity. So because everything largely hinges on contract rather than layers of federal or state guidance, it's pretty simple, but that's also the downside because those same contracts can limit enforcement. So there were times where often provider behavior may have felt slightly wrong, but if it's contractually allowed, your options are limited. So it can make commercial investigations feel definitely quite a less amount aggressive than Medicare and Medicaid work. So yeah, that's my perspective on commercial payers. It's very contract heavy, very member driven. Sometimes it's definitely less dramatic than what you'd see on media or TV, but it's still super important. And especially when it comes to protecting the member and the payer itself, commercial SIU is definitely not very dramatic from the outside, but it's, in my opinion, a lot like maintenance work that when it's done well, nobody really notices you, but when it's
Mm.
not, everyone will feel it. So,
Savannah, this really intrigues me. I don't know if you knew this or not, but before a lifetime before I became a nurse and into the healthcare field, I was in the legal field and everything was about contracts. If you didn't
yeah.
have a contract, nothing mattered. So I'm just curious if you know, providers can like negotiate to have specific clauses in their contracts so that they're able to do things that maybe other providers wouldn't be able to do?
And there's a fine line to answering that because I definitely don't want to divulge anything we shouldn't. But there is a line where if their contract says they can, then it would be really hard to deny a claim, even if it's against coding guidelines. So there's a specific provider I have in mind that I used to work with that was allowed to kind of utilize unlisted codes for a specific service that maybe there was a more specific code they could have used, but they signed a contract saying for this service, they're allowed to use this code. So even though looking from the outside, you could say there was probably overutilization of an unlisted code and that they could have used a more specific, their contract said they could, so it was really hard to deny them that. So there are times where sometimes things would feel a bit questionable, but their contract is Bible, so you kind of got to let it be.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's something I would definitely love to dig a little bit deeper into. But
Yeah,
for
for sure.
today, we are going to follow up with our last, but certainly not least, colleague here, Janice, my favorite Janice that I know. You worked for a Medicaid agency. Talk to us a little bit about that. But first, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so hi. As Daphne said, my name's Janice. I've been with Healthcare Fraud Shield for about 8 months, so not too long. I originally started off working for a state Medicaid program integrity unit, otherwise known as an MPI. I started off in their intake unit and eventually ended up working in their investigations unit by the end of my time there. After that, I worked for a managed care organization where I also started off in their intake unit and then moved on to investigations. So I kind of got to see the building blocks of investigations before I was even there, which was really, really nice. Kind of working from the bottom to the top. So in total, I've been in this industry for about 9 years. And like the ladies before me, as a disclaimer, everything I share is from my personal experience. So you know, like Kate mentioned earlier, it's been a while since I've worked at some of these, so there might be some details that slip my memory, but generally working for an MPI unit is very similar to working for an SIU or a UPIC. Um, at MPI, we received leads primarily from tips. We also called them complaints from time to time, but they are very helpful in identifying some fraud, waste, and abuse. So we do like to try to call them tips over complaints. And those generally came from the public, uh, members, recipients, neighbors, family members, anybody who knew of anything questionable going on. They could send either an online complaint form or they could call a hotline to report their tip. We also obtained leads from referrals that we received from our contracted MCOs. We looked at news articles for things that were happening to help kind of figure out if there was anything going on in our realm. And then we also relied on EOMBs, which are explanations of Medicaid benefits. That's everybody gets them no matter what type of insurance you have. And more times than not, unfortunately, those EOMBs, the lead kind of would come up dry just because they're sometimes very vague in what they're telling you received, and people don't always know. So, yeah, those were the primary places that we got leads from. As far as investigative steps, we had a few different areas. So we had a more administrative unit that focused on issues that were not in compliance with policy, right? Whether that's state or federal Medicaid policy. And those reviews, audits, for lack of a better word, would kind of be done in-house by a bunch of different staff, auditors, nurses, pharmacists, people of all backgrounds, which was really, really great. But then we also had our investigations unit that focused on concerns primarily of fraud. And in that unit, when we're working our cases, we would make sure that we're researching the provider and or the members, because sometimes the members are involved in the scheme, or you need to know the member's history a little bit better to kind of narrow in on the scheme that the provider is perpetrating. So we would review our internal systems. We would review open sources, the internet, social media, licenses, corporate records, all of those good things. Get a good background on the provider to understand what we're looking at. It's also really nice to kind of pull a background report to assess what kind of assets these providers have. Did they just buy a new Maserati? Are they living in a 7-bed, 5-bathroom house? Just crazy, crazy things that can sometimes point to unscrupulous activity. We'd also conduct some data analysis during that investigation, and we would also review policies and state and federal regulations. At that point, when we're reviewing regulations, we're kind of trying to figure out, is this more administrative? Do we just want to go after an overpayment? Or is this fraud? Is there criminal activity involved? Does it need to go to our law enforcement entity? And if so, we want to be careful about conducting provider interviews or requesting records, because sometimes that can tip providers off that they're being investigated. And we don't want to tip them off prior to law enforcement looking at them. So that was something that we really kind of waited until the last minute to determine, what are our findings? What are we seeing? Does it meet the level of fraud, or is it simply just abusive? Sometimes we would refer to MFCU, which is our state law enforcement agency for Medicaid. We would refer to them, and in an abundance of caution, and they would sometimes send stuff back and say, hey, there's nothing criminal here. So we would proceed with our administrative actions, overpayments, prepay review, anything we felt was necessary. Other things that we referred to MFCU and that they accepted, we had to be put it on the back burner. We did not touch it anymore. We didn't interact with the providers anymore. We did not want to hinder their case. So that was something that we were very mindful of during our investigation, was the referral process. Um, you know, in addition to referring to MFCU at my state MPI, we referred to a bunch of different entities. We would refer to Department of Health for medical license review, Department of Insurance. Sometimes we would get tips that didn't pertain to Medicaid, and unfortunately, we couldn't look into it. So we would have to refer it to the entity that could. And being able to refer to all these places requires a certain level of collaboration. The more places you collaborate with, the better outcome we're going to have in kind of getting rid of some of these bad actors. So I'm a big, big proponent of collaboration. As far as tips, there are two main tips that I would recommend. The first one is understanding allegations. Allegations sometimes can come in and be very gray. Maybe that you have to read between the lines, but you also don't want to put words in the reporter's mouth. So you've got to kind of make sure that you're really understanding the allegations coming through. We cannot be experts in all fields. So it's really important that, we lean on our coworkers who might be subject matter experts, or as I like to call them, SMEs. We want to lean on people who have that expertise in certain areas, just to make sure that we're doing the best review possible. My second tip: pivot tables. Learn how to do them. It's typically not the first thing people are trained on in this industry, but I cannot stress how pivotal it is to learn how to do pivot tables. Um, Pivot tables can help you get hard, solid numbers, and that's more helpful for law enforcement who doesn't always understand the medical jargon. So, definitely having hard numbers to provide people, especially for large data sets, is going to be really, really helpful. There were some pros to working for an MPI. Some of them were, I had access to both fee for service and encounter data, which means I could see the state Medicaid claims and then the claims paid by our contracted MCOs. I got to see the whole big picture, which was really helpful in actually narrowing in on fraud and abuse a lot easier than having a small data set. Also, you didn't have to worry about provider abrasion. We could be very blunt with these providers. We did not have to have customer service aspect. I kind of missed that for a while. And you do have a more direct line to impact policy changes. We could, at MPI, if we did an investigation and had some findings that we felt needed to be updated in policy, we could send that recommendation to our policy unit with the state. And sometimes they would implement it, other times they would not. But, the times that they did, we counted them as big wins. Some cons for working for an MPI are it's a government entity, right? And with government entities, you don't always get the newest, most up to date systems. Most of the time, because you have to let people bid. And you have to sign an extended contract with them for that system. It's just part of the state process. So, that's sometimes what could cause a little bit of a hindrance with investigations. Sometimes there'd be power struggles between agencies that should be working together that could hinder collaboration. The units and departments might not work as well together as they should. And we're all working towards one goal, so we should all want to work together. And the final con would be life in Medicaid is like a roller coaster. Things are constantly changing at both this national and the state level. Then you've got internal department politics and all of these things that are constantly changing your processes and how you do things. So it'd be up and down, but nonetheless, that's where I started off at. And it is when I knew I wanted to do this. So yeah, I wouldn't change a thing. All of these experiences, they build on each other. So yeah, that's pretty much MPI in a nutshell.
And Janice, I should inform the listeners that you worked in Florida. So your unit was probably pretty busy and saw a lot of very interesting things.
Yes, yes. We were constantly turning cases over, constantly getting really big record reviews. I mean, it's definitely a uphill battle.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Just listening to all three of you really highlights why our team here at Healthcare Fraud Shield is so strong, because we're really pulling from the experiences of a lot of diverse agencies. So to wrap it up, we've set the stage for these different investigative worlds. And next episode, Kate, Savannah, and Janice will join us for part 2. And that's where we're going to get into the weeds a little bit more and answer a listener's question about some of the real world differences in investigation and prevention when Medicare is primary versus when Medicaid is primary.
I don't know about you, Mandy, but I'm super excited for this upcoming episode, part 2 of this. We're going to use a specific case study to illustrate how the investigation pivots depending on whether you're in a UPIC, a commercial plan, or a state Medicaid office. We'll look at the minimum standards and how they differ, how regulatory and compliance requirements change the game, and why those jurisdictional boundaries matter so much. Until then, thanks for tuning into the F Files.
Everything that has been discussed in this podcast is based on our day-to-day experiences.
Any opinions stated by myself, Mandy, or any guests during the podcast are not necessarily representative of the opinions or views of Healthcare Fraud Shield.